Christopher Phin, who should just explain that I've known since, would it be the last century, Christopher? We were temporarily colleagues at Mac User magazine when it still existed in the UK on its own, both in relatively minor roles at the beginning of our careers. And we seem to have crossed paths from time to time ever since then, and we've each been doing different things. So Christopher began very much as a journalist, like, reporting and reviewing and doing stuff that you do on a computer magazine, and then very quickly moved on to other places. He's edited so many technical magazines and so on, in London, also at Future, really made his name at Future, if I remember correctly, on Mac magazines there as well. Over time, you were, I believe, at one point for several years, associate lecturer at the LCC. Is that correct? Yeah,
that's right.
Okay, so not the only person from Mac User actually ended up there as well.
Indeed.
But in recent years, Christopher's really made his name in the world of podcasting. And he ended up back in, you're not from Dundee, are you, Christopher? No. But you went up to DC and started pretty much from scratch, I believe.
Completely from scratch.
Complete podcasting center, and a kind of I don't know, it almost became a focus for the rest of the country to see what a major newspaper publisher was doing in terms of podcasting. And you just had the explosion of regular podcasts, and you've written about it and produced and advised and consulted over the past couple of years as well. And you're even more available now. And you'd written this excellent piece in publishing about podcasting and ways of actually turning it into making money and so on. I thought, wouldn't it be interesting for you to pass on some tips and advice and some of your background about the world of podcasting for freelance journalists who may be doing it and speak on it. So if everyone else could make sure you're muted, apart from Christopher, I'm going to pass over to Christopher, who will introduce himself and talk to us a bit about podcasting and the opportunities it may open up for us as freelance journalists. So Christopher, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Dabbs. I think I won't bother introducing myself. That was fairly exhaustive. I think the stuff I did at DC Thomson, which started in about 2019, and that started because I pulled off the impressive trick, if you can do it, of making my own role redundant as the head publisher for a magazine within the group. And it was obvious that that magazine, which had been acquired, should never have run as a little fiefdom as it did for a while. So it should have been folded into the main magazine business at DC Thomson. So I made myself as publisher redundant, along with my sales director, sadly. But I did some other stuff within DC Thomson. I got the job title of Special Projects Lead, which we'll all in this room know is dog's body by any other name. But as part of that process, I'd spoken to our chief exec and said the thing I'd really like to do for DC Thomson is start its podcasting ambitions. And I was really fortunate to find in Mike Watson, the then chief exec, somebody who loves podcasts, indeed paid for some podcasts himself. And so I created this little sort of skunk worksy type thing within the organization, which eventually produced more than a dozen shows, ranging everything from fiction for the People's Friend and My Weekly through to sport for the newspapers and politics. We had energy industry B2B titles, a whole mess of stuff. And it was great because it was a good chance to experiment with different ways of building shows, different ways of building commercialization and monetization strategies around the shows, and also just to like scale up, because I'd had podcasts personally. And I'm a techie guy, as Mr. Dabbs alludes to. I worked on a bunch of computer magazines, but there was still, like, every time you open up a digital audio workstation, it's a fairly terrifying looking thing, much more so than a word processor. And so that process of scaling up and then disseminating that audio best practice and learnings was a real joy. Alistair says I'm more free and available now. That's because for some reason best known to itself, DC Thomson made the role of head of podcast, which is what I was, redundant in August of last year. As I'm sure everyone in this room probably knows, DC Thomson also ran another swathe of redundancies, some of which are running to completion now, with a lot of staff leaving the business. So right now I'm doing a bunch of consultancy stuff. So I'm effectively freelance. I do some work, particularly relevantly for this conversation, for a podcast production company in London called Message Heard. But that's enough for me. Let's talk a little bit about podcasting stuff. I'm going to invert the normal flow of this talk that I would give, and we're going to start with the last thing, because it's what Alistair wanted me to start with, and it's money. How do you make money from podcasting? And I'm going to split that into two things. One is, how do you make money from the podcasts themselves, whether that's within an organization or your own show that you're doing, and then a little bit more about how you can do stuff, how you can ingratiate yourself into that process as a freelancer as well. Obviously, there will be a sort of formal Q&A section at the end of this, but please do raise your hand if you've got any questions, or if I'm talking too quickly or I'm otherwise difficult to parse. So, making money. In the podcast itself, the way people think about making money in a podcast is through ads, and that's fine, and you can. However, it's the first thing you learn about, but it's the first thing to dismiss for most of us. The revenue you can generate from dynamically inserted ads, i.e. ads that you don't book in. It's like running display ads online. You just say, hey, you can have an ad here, guys, and then you do a bit of subject matching. And a big company like AdsWiz or Global, through their DAX platform, or Acast, will serve ads into that. But the revenue you can generate from that, unless you're getting tens of thousands of downloads per episode, is rubbish. And nobody, so there's a stat in podcasting, and you can kind of, you can find different versions of this stat depending on which data source you look at. But let's pick one of those data sources and say the number is 39, that magic number 39. And that number is the number of downloads you have within the first week of a podcast episode going live. And above that number, you're in the top 50% of all podcasts in the world ever. So if you've got 40 downloads a week, 40 downloads in the first week of a podcast episode going live, you are one of the 50% best podcasts, most popular podcasts in the world. But it's not just a logarithmic scale from there. The ability to become the top 25 and then the top 10, the top 5, top 1 point, so on, it becomes so much harder because there are some big beasts in this space that dominate the industry and that break through and that have their intellectual property turned into shows for Netflix, that kind of thing. But unless you are at that scale, ads just don't really make sense. Sponsorship makes much more sense. And so, for example, with I spoke about this publicly when I worked there, so I can talk about it publicly now. One of our shows at DC Thomson was called Energy Voice Out Loud, and that was a oil, gas, and renewable energy B2B podcast. Excellent show, genuinely excellent, absolutely fascinating, and a lot of political will from the head of that unit to make it make sense. But that show had a small number of downloads, hundreds of numbers of downloads. So, maybe 200-300 downloads per episode, so tiny. And yet it managed to generate significant revenue. So it did, I think, about $500,000 in its first year, about $1 million in its second year, and it was only growing. And that was through sponsorships. Now, it's a classic thing with sponsorships, of course, that as you are talking, it's magazine publishing, right? The narrower and better defined your audience is, the better you can monetize that to advertisers. I will say, I think a lot of people express skepticism when I talk about that as an example, because they go, well, oil and gas, isn't it? Like, you can get tons of money, they're all rolling in it. And that's true to an extent. I think a better reason that made such a success of it was that it was a highly professionalized sector. It was a sector that was hungry for innovation, and so we could generate revenue that way. But sponsorship for the shows, in association with call at the start, maybe a mid-roll ad in the middle, perhaps some call to action at the end, that can make sense. You can use podcasts, of course, to generate revenue elsewhere. A lot of the big newspapers will use their podcasts as a way of bringing subscribers into the fold. Podcasts are good at reaching out to a new audience, particularly a younger audience than is traditionally spoken to by legacy media. It sounds like can you think of a way of saying that doesn't sound so disparaging? But you know what I mean, right? So if you are The Economist, for example, it's quite hard to get new, younger people to read The Economist. The podcast is a good way of doing that. Same with The New Statesman, in fact, which has done an amazing work in this space. There's an example, there's a question there from Phil about how much money you can make. So let's say the cost per 1,000 plays for a podcast is perhaps £4 or £5. So every 1,000 times that ad is served into a podcast, you'll get £4 or £5. And since most podcasts will perhaps, it's so hard to give a general idea of how many downloads a podcast will get. But for a lot of so the New Statesman, as an example, gets something like 50,000 downloads a week, and it's chunky. So if they were doing dynamically and served ads, they'd get a decent paycheck at the end of the year, but still not retirement money, still not going home money. But they would. But if you were just, if you were making a small industry show, or if you were talking to a smaller audience, you're talking tens of pounds. So it's really not. It's not a way of generating revenue in a way that makes sense. For sponsorships, Phil, it's the old way of doing advertising. It's, hey guys, I've got an audience that I know you want to talk to, and I'm going to charge you this much to talk to them. And it's a educated guess about how much you can charge that client to be in front of the audience. I will say with podcasting, because it's an incredibly intimate and sticky medium, it's one that really brings an audience in, and it clasps them tight to its bosom. And so you can generate a very close relationship with an audience in a way that's harder to do with other forms of media. Now, understand, please, as I talk about like the great things podcasting can do, that's not because I think podcasting is the best medium and everybody should just do podcasting and ignore everything else. I'm fully cross-media. I think everything has its strength. But particularly with podcasting, it is that way of turning fans into friends and really bringing them along the journey with you. And so that's an audience that is valuable to the advertiser, because they are in your space and you can then sell them shit. You can use those voices that they've built a relationship with to move them to a purchase intent. I will say with podcasting, there is no, at least not at the technical level, no link between I am listening to this podcast ad about mattresses, I am now tapping a button. There's no button to go and buy that, so I can track that conversion. Podcasting advertising is much more brand awareness, brand building stuff. I was on generating revenue elsewhere. Of course, you can use podcasting to generate subscribers, or if you do a big show at the NEC once a year, then you can use your podcast as a way of generating ticket sales for that, as an example. Crowdfunding is really popular, Patreon being one of the biggest ones, but there are others. It can be hard for a publishing company, I think, to put the begging cap out and say, oh, please support this podcast, because they'll go, you're Reach PLC, you support this podcast if you like this podcast so much. There are ways around that, I think. So there's a really good examples of a women's running title where the show almost, and this is quite a dangerous thing, right? But the show almost became divorced from the parent brand. It took on a life of its own, which is concerning, because you're like, well, why is the brand doing it if the brand isn't accruing brand reputation back? I think the reason that makes me excited was because they were able to successfully run crowdfunding campaigns to say, support this podcast. There's nobody else doing women's running just like how we are, because it didn't feel like it was then coming. It felt like it was coming from the two co-hosts, not from big publishing PLC. People always ask when you should do Patreon. The usual answer is when people ask for it and not before. What do people want from a crowdfunding thing? Well, they quite often will like the idea of direct access, being able to talk directly to you, whether that's in like a Discord server or a chat room of some description, or you get the ability. Here's a podcast recommendation for you. Go and listen to the brilliant podcast Ologies. It's a phenomenal example of how you can take an audience into the show without it becoming just a sort of, Saturday morning phone-in radio program all about shout-outs for anybody who's listening. The people who are Patreon supporters for that show can ask questions to the guests. They can pre-submit questions to the guests. It adds editorial value to it as well. The other key learn there is people generally want to get more of the same, not something different. So a lot of podcasters, when they go to do crowdfunding will go, hey, support the show for $10 a month and we'll send you stickers. And people are like, I don't want stickers. I want the show. The show is the thing I like. I don't like stickers. And so they just want to have, extended episodes, more episodes, special episodes, that kind of thing. The other thing, of course, the podcast can do, and I'm only touching on the sort of major pillars here, of course, but the other significant thing that you can do in podcasting these days is live shows, ticketed live shows. A brilliant example of that, of course, is Deborah Francis White's The Guilty Feminist podcast, which is usually done in front of a live audience. That's a ticketed event. It wasn't always the case, but it is now. And that idea of being able to build, and it's, you might have tried, you or organizations you've worked with might have tried to do ticketed events before, which are always quite challenging, because converting a floating audience into, I'm going to pay you 20 quid and I'm going to come into the NEC to an event can be quite challenging. But with podcasting, you are ambiently always building a very tight and engaged and passionate audience of friends. It is like you're rocking up. And I did a show for DC Thompson called Walk to Wellbeing, which is a lovely format. We would interview celebrities, not unusual, but what we would do is, rather than having a conversation with a celebrity, we would send them a little clip-on lav mic that was a recorder, a battery-powered recorder as well, tiny little thing, lovely audio from it, called an Instamic, and we would send them out for a walk on their own, and we'd send them in the flight case with the mic a series of prompt cards that they would then sort of self-interview with as they walked in a place where they felt comfortable. And so we had the ambient sound of where they were. And those ideas of being able to bring an audience along with you, and it was almost like, when you listen to that show, it was almost like you were rather creepily sidling up alongside the celebrity and just walking beside them as they talked. Because as well, there was no sort of start to the interview. The audio just sort of faded in. So it was literally like, you were just like, that person looks interesting. And they're talking to themselves in public. I'll walk alongside them and listen to them. We did, by the way, say to the guests that if they wanted to like hold the phone up to their ear, like not on, but just so it looked like they weren't just wandering around the beach talking to themselves, then they could. Couple of questions that have come in while we come in here. Conversations rather than monologues. There is absolutely no rule about what makes a successful thing and what doesn't, in the sense that there's no killer format. I will say that traditional conversations, 3 people around the table talking about something for 45 minutes is one of the simplest formats you can do. And that's not a disparagement. That can be a reason that you'll be able to do it. Right? If you want to do a podcast, just like 3 people around the table talking for 40 minutes is a pretty easy format to do. And if the choice is, do something better, but it takes you 6 months of development time to get there, and one person day a week to put together, and you haven't got that capacity, then maybe you can't do that. But if you can just do 3 people around the table talking, then that is a way of doing it. But I'll come back to formats later if you remind me. Starting harder than it looks, absolutely is. Dedicated, jumpstart with some external people would be great. And that thing of committing is really important. The question that's there, or observation rather. People talk about the secret to podcasting. People also talk about the golden age of podcasting being over. I think that's never going to be true, because as much as a new medium will have an impact on media that preceded it, we still have cinema, we still have books. They're very different beasts than they were when those were the preeminent forms of media, especially for mass media dissemination, but we still have them. And that will always be true for podcasts. There's always be a story to be told, a voice that we haven't heard. If you're just going to do another daily news update podcast, then maybe think again. But generally speaking, there'll always be an interesting way of doing things. Right. How freelancers can bring their skills to bear on this. And these are in order of, you actually haven't got a hope in hell of doing this, to, no, this is a legitimate thing that could happen. So the first one on that list that you haven't got a hope in hell of doing is voice acting. And that's not to suggest that you don't all have beautiful voices. It's to suggest that generally speaking, the industry does not support, in the UK, doesn't support voice acting as a thing, or doing paid voiceovers. And obviously, when I'm being slightly facetious, some do. There is some ability. There will be some capacity for that, especially also in audiobook work. But it is a very difficult and small market to break into. Next up, hosting. Actually, hosting one of that podcast for somebody else is absolutely a thing you can do. If you have got a bit of spark and spunk about you, if you're familiar with how to use a microphone as well as how to bring out a conversation from somebody, absolutely the idea of hosting. So a brilliant example for that is The Week Unwrapped. Obviously, everyone loves The Week. The Week Unwrapped is their podcast, and when they started it, so The Week Unwrapped is one of my favorite podcasts, one of my favorite examples of how a legacy brand can reinvent itself. So The Week, of course, its mission is to look at the news internationally and domestically over the course of a week and summarize it into a digest that's published once a week. What they did with the podcast was take the same basic idea, but give it a twist. Give it something that was going to be more interesting and more digestible. And it was the idea that there would be a round table of 3 journalists around a central host, and they would each bring an underrepresented, underreported story to the table. Present it for, this is the thing we'll be talking about, this is the thing this week will be remembered for, and then have a discussion about it. So an interesting twist on the format. Again, they use it as a subscriber driver as one of those big things. But when they started it, they realized they had a skill shortage, a skill gap. They couldn't host it themselves. They were too flighty, too nervous, too inexperienced. And so they brought in a ringer. So the very experienced broadcaster, Ollie Mann, was brought in to act as the host for that show, and it's really good. Slight challenge there is they're now stuck with him. Unfair way of putting it, but it would be very hard to change that format now that the team are more experienced. And there's little hints and tips in there about how to bring people together for that. So I know that team, for example, when they would sit down, they were still very nervous and inexperienced at doing this work. But what they would do is they would play a board game or card game before they recorded, just to loosen themselves up. Quite a luxury in a working day. But I think that's a good idea to be able to break that sense of, oh my God, there's a microphone on me. Podcast development work is really key, particularly if you've got some narrative storytelling abilities. The idea that you'd go in and actually help a company to develop a format is achievable. Even more achievable still is the idea of doing transcriptions. So a lot of all podcasts really should be produced with transcripts. Very few are. There are very good SEO reasons for producing full transcripts, but there are also very good accessibility reasons for producing full transcripts of your shows. A lot of people who do transcripts will just run it through something like Otter and get an AI transcript at the end of it. All of us will be familiar with the fact that things like Otter are pretty good these days, but still not perfect. And particularly if you have a domain specialism, if you work as a medical journalist or a technical journalist or something, you will see horrendous errors coming through that the AI just isn't aware of in that particular vertical. The idea of either producing by hand or correcting auto-produced transcript is reasonable. Then we come on to the idea of producing. So actually just being the producer for a show, and that producer is quite a wide-ranging remit. It might be sitting in the recording with the talent and making sure they do what they're supposed to do, reminding them, no, that's not how we start the show. You say this, and then you say this, and then you say that, reminding them of the format points, or just encouraging them and reminding them that everything's going to be okay, that we can edit stuff. And then it might be editing, which brings me on to the last thing. Generally speaking, one of the skills that is most useful in the space is in editing. I've got some questions here which I'll try and rattle through a little bit. Oh yeah, I forgot to complete that point. Committing to a year, I agree with, or at least a year. I think the idea you've like one of the brilliant things about podcasting is it is quite a low. It's not the ill-fated and much argued and sworn over pivot to video. It requires much lower investments in kit and time, and you can produce something that is 80% good much more easily than you could do something that's 80% good in a video format or an animated format, for example. But the idea of committing and sort of holding your nerve and just doing the thing for at least a year is probably not a bad idea. Best platforms for beginners at podcasts. It depends what you're asking, particularly Deborah. If in terms of recording and editing the show, you can get around some of the technical stuff using a platform like Riverside, which can spit out a recording for you of all the voices on a single track. You can even do video clips through Riverside, but the more you can take manual control, the better. A question from Mick about monetizing. You should always have an eye on sustainable podcasting. And for a lot of people that will mean money. You have to generate X because we've used Y time from the staff, and therefore, or from your time, and therefore, in order to make it wash its face, it has to generate X in revenue terms, and that's fine. There is also the way of doing it that thinks about, we're going to build an audience through here, assess after 6 months, and then see what we can do with that audience. The specific answer to the question is, I don't think you need to think about monetizing per se, but there are other ways of commercializing the show and making it sustainable. And the reason you want to do that is because you don't want to create a situation in which the podcast is the first and easiest thing to kill, I think. Starting from scratch, what's a financial investment? Let me switch my cameras here so you can see the desk that's in front of me. There are a bunch of different bits and pieces you can get. So this is a Samsung Q2U. It is a microphone that costs about 60, 70 quid. And it's nice because it has both an XLR port on the bottom and a USB port. So you can connect that up directly to your PC or Mac and just record straight from that into your Mac or PC. Similarly, if you're using a virtual studio platform like Riverside or Zencaster, then you can use that to join those things. I would recommend spending, 60 or 70 quid, recommend spending a bit more. This is the Samsung Q9U, which is the equivalent of this microphone that I'm talking to you on just now. So this is what this one sounds like. This one is XLR only. This one is XLR and USB. This one has very good plosive rejection. So if I really try and force Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers, I can really force it and you'll get some plosives. But generally speaking, it's very good at giving you very good quality sound out of it. You can record, if you're recording more than one person, you could record onto something like the venerable Zoom H5 handy recorder here, which has got 2 XLR ports on the bottom of it, or indeed it's got some microphones in at the top as well, but those are better for ambient sound rather than capturing voices. Key thing is you want to try and get the microphone really close to your mouth. The more you do this, the less it will pick up ambient noise around you. And I don't just mean like, the sound of children playing nicely in the background. I mean room tone. So the sense of the space you're in. Alistair, in fact, picked me up at one point picked me up is too harsh, but raised a valid concern about the fact that I don't have soundproofing in front of me. There's no egg cartons or foam in front of me here at my desk. But this dynamic cardioid mic is good at rejecting that. If you're being particularly fancy or doing this in any way seriously, this bit of kit here is an astonishing piece of equipment. It might sound like a lot of money. It's £600 or £700, but this is a Rodecaster Pro 2 and it can do everything. It has got 4 microphone inputs or guitar inputs if you want. We can bring in audio from other sources. In this case, this is my iPad playing Goldberg Variations. Bring that in. There's like sound pads. So you can bring sound effects, or you can even do voice changing stuff as well. So if something is very important, then you can really make that point. And the point about this is that it is possible with a little bit of thought and creativity to put as much of the post-processing to work on the desk itself, rather than having to take stuff into post. But if you do take stuff into post, this is what an episode of a podcast I was working on recently might look like. There are 3 voices, as you might expect, as you might be able to parse from what you can see here. And if I play this, there you go.
Hello, welcome to the show. I'm Matt.
I'm Hannah.
I'm Steve, and you're listening to The Gaming Lobby. Well, good morning, people. Another rainy day in the UK.
The thing about this, so big digital audio workstations like this always do look quite intimidating and scary when you first load them up, because there's just hundreds and hundreds of buttons, even more so than something like InDesign, which is scary enough, or Quark in itself. But it is worth putting in the effort to learn to use a tool like this. Or another example that's really well thought of in this space is Hindenburg, particularly has a journalist version of its editing tool as well. But what you really want is multi-track recording. You want each voice in its own track. And that's in part because you want to be able to address those voices separately. So I've got different effects applied to each of those voices to make them sound better. But also because you get more flexibility in correcting mistakes and correcting for crosstalk as well. And you'll see, if I zoom in here, see this little green clip at the bottom here, you'll see this horizontal yellow line coming along here, which then dips up and then dips down again. Unsurprisingly, that's controlling the volume.
Who knows what?
Cheers. Cheers all.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.
This has been a Why Now production with your host, Matt Taylor, Steve Kelly, Hannah,
etc. But the point I'm wanting to make here is things like those fades in the music are built into my template. So I'm just loading up a new episode, dropping the audio in, doing a lot of cutting and moving around and editing. But by the fact that I can use a tool like this, it means that I've got a bit more flexibility and also more ability to recover from my own stupidity. A lot of people, when they're starting in podcasting, will start with Audacity, which is a free audio editor, open source. I've got a lot of time for Audacity. The problem with it is a destructive editor. So every change you make gets baked down and used in subsequent versions that you do. So if you realize 40 steps later you made a mistake 40 steps ago, you can't then go back and recover it. Whereas with Audition, let's say I cut this piece of music in half and I delete this first half and I go, oh no, I've deleted music. Like that and clip back out again, because you're not actually directly editing the music itself, you're editing proxies for the music. I think that'll probably do me for now. Let me switch back to my main presenter view and you ask me questions and I'll try and type in some answers.
That's been really, really good presentation. I mean, Alistair, yes, sorry, you can.
Yeah, no, I was just going to say thank you very much. That was really pithy. Christopher, that was just full of stuff that
so hard. You know what it's like trying to like boil down
no but
a lifetime's worth of experience into...
it's nice to actually deal with the things that people are asking. What kit are you using? How much did it cost? Which platform should it was all there, which is brilliant. Were there any other questions for Chris? Because I said we'd nab him up until 7:30. I know he's been on for half an hour already, but is there anything else?
I think John Osborne.
Sorry, I just wondered what I've had some experience of using Audacity, and I must admit I had exactly that same problem. I was trying to and some music I'd found, and I just found it very complicated.
It is.
I don't know whether you, sorry, I hope I'm not doing the wrong thing. I understand that one can record from radio, BBC Radio 3, providing it's only for your own use, but I think the Copyright Act allows it anyway. And if he doesn't, I won't do it again. But sufficient to say that I found it was very complicated. I was recorded a piece of music and then I found there was a mistake in the original, and then, it was really complicated. So Audacity generally works quite well for me.
So I'll say two things on there, if I may, John. One, Audacity is good and it's flexible and it's free. So no shade if anybody uses it. I strongly recommend against using it because it is destructive. So any change you make, you can't recover from. It's just bad practice. It's like photocopying a photocopy of a photocopy, bad juju. The other thing is just a tiny point on music in particular. I'm not talking particularly to your point, but you raised it and reminded me. Music in podcasting is an absolute minefield, because if you are going to be broadcasting music on a podcast, you don't fall under broadcast IP restrictions. You fall under mechanical reproduction IP restrictions. You've effectively become a music publisher. So I would deeply recommend against using any commercial music. Either use composed music or royalty-free stuff, or stuff that you can otherwise get rights to if you're actually going to publish it. We understand about fair dealing or fair use. The music industry is terrifying, and I wouldn't do it.
Okay, we've got about a few minutes left, and I've got at least 2 hands up. So if we can be quite succinct with the questions. Can I take Mel, then Geraldine, and then Ehai? I.
Yes, very briefly, if people have got some computer chops, Pro Tools free is available to people. It's not the multi-track that you use for music recording, but you can do a bloody good job on it. It has a reasonably steep learning curve, but it's a multi-track recorder and editor, and it's non-destructive. So you might want to check that out. Avid Pro Tools.
Just thank you. Geraldine?
Oh, just a more general question, because there are so many podcasts around now. Are there any shortage subject areas that, in terms of areas that haven't been touched by podcasts?
So yes, Geraldine, there are there are millions and millions of podcasts. If you manage to find one that's a subject that's underserved, you're a better man than I. I would usually generally encourage against that kind of thinking, just because, I don't know, it becomes a personal thing rather than a business thing. But I think finding the thing that matters to you, or indeed to an audience that you've identified, is going to be key. There is no shortage of like celebrities interviewing other celebrities about things that are interesting to celebrities, and we have seen fashions come and go. We're kind of over the hump of the fashion for true crime podcasts, for example. But still, there'll always be an appetite for these things. I think the reason I find that question hard to answer is, if you want to make the next million downloader breakaway hit, then probably finding that alchemy between underserved subjects and astonishing personalities allied to a good treatment is the way to go about it. Otherwise, like, podcasting still feels quite zine to me. It feels like the zine culture, and I think there's something joyous about that.
Thank you. Is it forgive me for the mispronunciation. Ehi?
Yeah, thank you. Chris, just thanks for coming to talk with us. I just want to quickly ask this question about podcast on Facebook or YouTube. I am currently doing something on Facebook Live. What I do is I'm using this Aerocaster Live. I don't know if you know about the equipment. Yeah, Aerocaster, which enables me to do these things via my mobile phones, no wire involved, so I can connect up to 4 to 5 cameras, different angles. Yeah, but I'm doing this via on Facebook Live. I just want to ask you, where do you think is a better platform to start off? Is it Facebook or YouTube, as the case may be?
It's a very, very different. The idea of doing a live show is a very different proposition from doing a podcast, because the thing about podcasting, if you're comparatively narrow with your definition of what a podcast is, it's an audio-only show that people can download to their phone and listen to asynchronously whenever they want. And the reason that I belabor that point is because the most important thing when you're planning a podcast is to think about where your audience is and when they're going to consume it. A daily news podcast you drop at 6 a.m. is going to be very different from a show you drop at 6 p.m. I'm going to answer the particular question you're asking in a second, but let me give a really quick example. There's a show I really love, as an example, called Chompers. By the way, ready your keyboarding fingers, folks, because you're going to answer the question I'm about to pose in your chat here. This show called Chompers comes out twice a day. It comes out in the morning and in the evening, and each episode is 2 minutes long. First person to correctly identify the context for that show wins a cookie. 2 minutes a time, morning and evening, twice a day. No cookies for anyone. The answer is it's for kids to brush their teeth to.
Oh.
Because you brush your teeth for 2 minutes, right? And it's actually delivered as much as an Alexa skill as it is as a podcast. But so the parent just yells at Alexa to read the thing out, and the kid will then brush their teeth while they're listening to amazing facts, then they'll stop. The reason I bring that up is because thinking about where the audience is and when really defines the nature of the show. And if you're talking about doing a live show, that's a very different thing, because you're demanding people pay attention at that point in their day. But you're asking me particularly about Facebook versus YouTube. The answer is YouTube. YouTube is an enormous discovery vector, even just for standard audio-only podcasts. And Alphabet is finally making investment into YouTube as a formal podcasting platform.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much, Christopher. Alison, would you like to say a final word?
Yeah, no. I just say thank you very, very much, Christopher, for coming on doing that. Or your own sound effects, of course. But that was brilliant. Thank you very much for your time. That was and Chris has given up his time for this, so appreciate that very much. You're free to spend the rest of the evening how you wish while we do branch business.
Lovely to meet you all.
Thank you so much, Chris. It was great.
You can find me technically on Twitter, but not really, Mastodon or LinkedIn if you want to get in touch, and I'll try and give you as much time as I can. Talk to you soon. Have a good day.
Bye-bye.